And now, a passage from Duluth and St. Louis County, Minnesota, their story and people. From Chapter 9, Duluth Triumphant. The return of prosperity to the zenith city of the unsalted seas. Dr. Thomas Foster's prediction. After 12 years of poverty and apparent stagnation, Duluth in 1869 came to life. Its growth was really too rapid to be stable and permanent, as the financial check of 1873 demonstrated. Yet the permanent works carried through during that brief period of activity on the North Shore were sufficiently substantial to make it impossible for Duluth to ever again fall back to the state of extreme poverty she experienced in the late 50s and early 60s. Luke A. Marvin, returning from school at St. Paul in 1867, found that an air of somnolence still hovered over the little settlement. He wrote, "There was not much change visible in Duluth. A few more houses had been erected, but there was an air of somnolence about the little settlement, and it was not until the Lake Superior and Mississippi Railroad came that it began to take on signs of life. Then it came with a rush. In the latter part of 1869 and in 1870, the people just came flocking in. In a few months, there were 2,000 or 3,000 people added to the population. There was no place to put them. There was not a hotel in the place, and every family had taken in as many as it could accommodate. And yet, there were thousands to be provided for. They lived in tents, they put up the rudest kinds of shacks for a temporary shelter, until they could erect houses. As fast as the sides and roof of a building were completed, and before doors or windows could be supplied, the place would be rented out for lodgings. The owner would take a piece of chalk and mark off on the floor space sufficient for a man to lie down, number the space, and rent it out. Tenants had to provide their own bedding and blankets. They would buy a piece of ticking, sew it into a bag, and go out and fill it with straw, shavings, sawdust, leaves. Anything that would answer the purpose of a bed, and then buy their blankets. They would do their own cooking over fires in the open air, or, if they were fortunate, they would get some of the inhabitants to give them table board. This rush of people comprised all classes. Most of them were from the eastern states. Some came to work on the railroad. Some came to engage in business. Others in lumbering, or came to work in the woods, as lumbering was then beginning to be a very important business, the railroads alone being great consumers of all kinds of timber for construction purposes. There was a sawmill at Oneota at that time, and another was started on the lake shore of Duluth. The entire outputs of these mills were sold before it was out, and when a vessel load of lumber came down from Oneota for delivery to the settlers, there would be scores of applicants ready to pay 2 or 3 times what it had been sold for. The owner of the sawmills was R.S. Munger, who saw Duluth grow in 6 months, from a little hamlet of 14 families to a place of 3,500 inhabitants. He said, "The first thing I did after coming to Duluth in January of 1869 was to engage in the lumber business. I had the machinery for a small sawmill shipped from St. Paul and erected my mill on the lake shore. The hills of Duluth furnished me for a long time with the finest quality of pine, and by the time I was in operation and the rush had set in, I couldn't begin to supply the demand. I got more machinery and started another mill up the St. Louis River, from which every day the lumber would be rafted down to Duluth. It did seem as if I could never be able to satisfy the demand. The hills of Duluth and out on Minnesota Point were dotted by thousands of tents, all kinds of the rudest kinds of shacks, and all those thousands were clamoring for lumber in order that they might erect houses. It was a good business, and I made money rapidly. Return of public plow demanded. Duluth was certainly taking shape when the editor of the weekly Minnesotian saw the necessity of inserting a notice in that pioneer Duluth paper requesting that the parties who had surreptitiously borrowed the public plow would return it to the authorities, as it was necessary to carry out some contemplated public improvements. Grading of roads or public highways had hitherto had little part in the public works of the North Shore. It is more than probable. Superior Street in 1869. Henry Trulson, who first saw Duluth on May 8, 1869, landing at Peyton and Kimball's dock. from a small ferry boat Captain Thompson was then running between Superior and Duluth, described Superior Street, Duluth, as he first remembered it. He said, "At that time, Superior Street was only a country road that had been cut through. The hillside forest ran right down to the street or road, and when a settler wished to erect a cabin, he was compelled to clear away the forest where now stand magnificent houses. The street was up and down like a billowy sea, and later day grades were made by filling in the hollows." Opening of navigation. The zenith city of the unsalted seas. In May 1869, there was a great influx of settlers. So great, indeed, that it would almost seem that the publication in the Weekly Minnesotan of May 1st, 1869, of an optimistic and prophetic speech delivered before the straggling few Duluth hearers on the 4th of July of the previous year, 1868, was to some extent responsible for this rush. It, of course, was not, for news did not travel very quickly in those days, and the little Duluth sheet of 1869 would hardly have had a wide exchange list, nor would its opinions be likely to be quoted extensively in outside journals. Nevertheless, those who did see a copy of the Weekly Minnesotan of May 1st, 1869, would certainly have been attracted by the glowing future Dr. Foster pictured for Duluth, the zenith city of the unsalted seas. His speech in part reads, "Fellow citizens, on this 4th of July, 1868, it would not be amiss to dwell mentally for a while upon the future of this region, which is even now looming up in the near distance, promising to pierce and lighten up these forests, with roadways and farm homesteads, to mine these rocks into material wealth, to whiten yon huge sea with clouds of canvas, or fret it with volumes of propelling steam, to cover the shores of these broad calm bays with mast-studded wharves and monster grain warehouses, and to erect within the sound of the surge of Superior's waves a great city, which shall be the abode of commerce and manufactures, and refinement and civilization, here nearly midway between the two main oceans of the world, the terminus, on the one hand, of 1,700 miles of land travel from the Pacific Ocean eastward, and the terminus of 1,600 miles of water transportation westward from the Atlantic Ocean, to the headquarters of the mighty St. Lawrence, of which that magnificent expanse of water spread out northeastward before you is but the widening and tributary. The dawn comes. The daylight is really breaking in the east, in the west, and in the south, and soon the sun of our progress, keeping pace with the steam railroad car, will shed its effulgence upon these pine and birch-clad and rock-bound shores. I hesitate not to bid you, with almost the confidence inspired by transpired fact, to believe that the railroad that will bridge over the short portage of 150 miles between the Great Lakes and the Great Mississippi will certainly be completed in the short time of 2 years from now. Dr. Foster assured his hearers that there was no delusion this time. Work on the railroad at the St. Paul end had actually begun. The first locomotive had actually arrived and been placed on the road, and in a very few more mails to be brought by the stagecoach, so soon to be obsolete, they might expect to read an account of the formal opening of at least 20 miles of the road, and that this fall, or in the ensuing spring at the farthest, work will be commenced on this end of the line. He continued, "I speak to you in no uncertain or dubious terms. The time for doubt has fled. We deal now with certainties, and we can trust now to the truthfulness of promises based upon it." He predicted that on the 4th of July, 1870, the head of the lakes, a great region of God's most magnificent creation, would be redeemed, regenerated, and disenthralled from the vassalage of an iron physical nature, and lack of communication with the outside world. The completion of the railway would give Duluth voice to be heard by the rest of the world, and the head of the lakes, by the hands of the artificers, would be fashioned into a different shape, less wild, less rude, less forbidding, more genial, better fitted for the enjoyment of civilized inhabitants. The transformation. Yes, continued Dr. Foster, when we meet here again on July 4th, 1870, beautiful nature will be here in all her prominent features. but they will be varied from what they are now by new forms of beauty and force. The embellishments in this book of nature will be long strings of railroad cars, arriving and departing, arriving with 15 million bushels of grain annually. And in the same picture, we will see numerous fleets of propellers conveying that grain as fast as possible to the eastern markets. It will be embellished by immense elevators, rivaling those of Chicago, Toledo, and Buffalo, in height and capacity, which will receive that vast mass of grain from those cars for storage and for those propellers. That Dr. Foster was justified in expecting that the bulk of the grain from points to the westward would come to Duluth is shown by other records. General W.G. Leduc, one of the first to initiate the railway project to link the Mississippi with Lake Superior, stated in the first year of the operation of the LS and MRR, the rate for wheat to water lake navigation at Milwaukee was 22 cents a bushel, and it dropped to 11 cents immediately on the opening of the road. He made a close estimate of the grain shipped that season, and asserted that the opening of the road meant a saving of $3 million to the farmers of the state. Again, what a transformation between the Duluth of 1868, when Dr. Foster spoke, and the Duluth of the present. In 1918, the receipts and shipments at Duluth Superior Harbor totaled to 53,746,358 tons of commerce, valued at $537,514,906. Lake shipments of grain from Duluth Superior in a recent season, 1915, totaled to 118,029,789 bushels, which meant that grain storage facilities at the harbor must have been immense. There are 26 elevators in Duluth Superior Harbor, the whole providing storage capacity for 36,325,000 bushels. Dr. Foster expected much, but never in his most sacred, secret, unpublished dreams. Probably did he ever imagine that Duluth would take high place among the great ports of the world. Yet the Duluth Superior Harbor, along its 49 linear miles of frontage, which has 6 miles of wharves, 10 wonderfully contrived ore docks, 24 coal docks, and 26 elevators, accommodated 11,925 vessels in 1913, the net registered tonnage of these ships being 35,982,013 tons. In the same year, New York, according to the statistics of the Bureau of Foreign and Domestic Commerce, Department of Commerce, accommodated in entered and cleared tonnage only 28,834,780 tons of shipping from and to foreign ports. The same list, published in the World Almanac for 1914, credited London with 20,978,223 tons. James J. Hill apparently had reason for placing Duluth first, London second, and New York third among the great ports of the world. Quoting Dr. Foster's speech again, the returning grain ships will be seen bringing coal in ballast from Pennsylvania to feed hundreds of factories for iron and wood in all their various forms. Undoubtedly, some grain ships as well as ore carriers return with coal as ballast, for in a recent year, 1918, 11,390,913 tons of coal came into Duluth Superior Harbor to supply the heat and power demands of this throbbing center of industry. Dr. Foster predicted that the whole region of the North Shore in Minnesota and the South Shore in Wisconsin will equally feel an impulse of prosperity from the great new fact of a completed railroad communication with the broad valley of the Mississippi. Immigrants will already have begun to pour in this direction, while the valleys and myriad lakelets and cascade streams of the country back from the North Shore will be occupied by the industrious, hardy, and intelligent Scandinavians of the north of Europe, who will here find a country and climate congenial to their habits, and who will keep coming until every 40 acres will have its separate family upon it, each annually cutting in the dense forest a continually widening circle of improvement around their homestead cabins. And the result has proved Dr. Foster to be correct, although the homesteading of St. Louis County land did not immediately follow the laying of the railway. St. Louis County had 696 farms in 1900. In 1910, there were 2,465, and in 1920, the number had increased to 4,271. The settlers are, in the main, the strong, hardy men from the northern countries of Europe, Finns in particular being successful and happy, finding climate and general conditions of farming almost identical to those of their own country. They have proved St. Louis County to be the premier potato country in the United States, and a land where clover is a weed, cutting from 3 to 4 tons an acre.
Hi Americana is bringing you the most unique and eclectic content you aren't going to find anywhere else. So if you enjoy this content, please head on over to Patreon to support the channel. The goal is to make this a full-time job. Thank you.